Ithioma stands in the courtyard of the Okafor compound and watches everything she owns burn, while the women of the household form a loose circle and say nothing. Her mother-in-law Beatrice stands at the centre of it all, with her arms crossed and her face set the way stone is set, not cruel, exactly, just certain that she is right. Certain that this woman beside the burning pile has failed in the only way that matters. Roland is not in the courtyard. He is inside the house. Behind a door he chose to close, in a room where he cannot be asked to witness what is being done in his name. He does not come out. Go, Beatrice says. Just that. One word. Flat as a verdict. A woman who cannot carry life has no place in this house. And Ithioma, who has swallowed 9 years of grief so quietly that even her own bones had forgotten the weight of it, picks up nothing, because there is nothing left to pick up, and she walks out of that gate. She does not look back, not because she is strong, but because she knows that if she turns around, she will not be able to keep moving. So she goes. What they did not know, what none of them could have known, was that the fire they built to erase her would become the very light that eventually exposed them. Ithioma Nwosu had a way of explaining things that made children lean forward in their chairs. She taught Primary 4 at Street, Bridget's community school, 31 children between the ages of 8 and 10, most of them barefoot by noon, all of them hers in the particular way that teachers claim children who are not their own. She knew which ones understood best when she drew diagrams. She knew which ones needed to be called on first, so they didn't spiral into shyness. She knew that little Emeka in the 3rd row chewed the collar of his shirt when he was nervous, and she had quietly spoken to his mother about it, gently, without making the boy feel watched. She was 25 when she married Roland Okafor. It was not a grand wedding. A canopy tent in the compound of his family's home, 40 guests, a photographer who arrived late and left before the dancing. But Roland had looked at her across the courtyard that afternoon with such open, uncomplicated happiness that Ithioma had felt something settle in her chest, the particular quiet of a thing finally arriving that you have been waiting for without quite admitting you were waiting. She believed he was choosing her the way she was choosing him, completely, eyes open, for keeps. The first year of trying felt like hope. The second year felt like patience. By the third, she had begun keeping a calendar. She knew the names of every hospital in the state that had a fertility unit worth speaking of. She had sat in waiting rooms with fluorescent lights and plastic chairs and outdated magazines, holding Roland's hand, answering questions calmly, even when the questions made her want to press her face into her palms. She had taken injections that left bruises on her arms like small purpling planets. She had drunk herbs that tasted of bark and old earth, brewed by firelight by an old woman in Newey who was said to have helped 12 barren women. She had fasted. She had prayed quietly at first, then desperately, then in the careful, measured way of someone who has learned not to want too loudly in case God mistakes the volume for ingratitude. Roland, in those early years, prayed with her. He was not a cruel man. That was the part that would take Ithioma the longest to understand, and the longest to forgive not his cruelty, but its absence. Because cruelty has edges you can name and point to and say, there, That is the thing that hurt me. What Roland did was gentler and more devastating than cruelty. He simply began to drift. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way a season changes, not in a single day, but in the accumulation of small shifts that you only recognize as a pattern when you look back at where you started and can no longer see it clearly. He stopped reaching for her hand in church. He began spending more evenings at his mother's end of the compound. He answered questions about children with a small, tight smile that did not meet his eyes, the smile of a man who has been privately told a story he is still deciding whether to believe. His mother had not been subtle. Mama Okafor was a woman who communicated in implications in sighs that were longer than necessary, in questions that weren't questions, in the way she looked at Ifeoma's stomach and then quickly away, as if the sight of it pained her. She did not say Barren. She said these things take time with some women. She did not say fault. She said we are praying for restoration. But meaning lived in the space between her words like smoke, and after enough years it had filled the whole compound. The aunties came with their pitying eyes and their soft voices and their casseroles, the kind of food people bring to grief. They called her Nur and patted her hands and said God's time was best. And Ifeoma smiled and thanked them, and felt each time as if she were being slowly erased. She was in the kitchen slicing tomatoes for pepper soup, the one thing that had never failed to make her feel like herself when she heard Roland's voice on the other side of the compound wall. He was speaking to someone, his cousin, she thought. His voice was low. "A man can only wait so long," he said. She set down the knife. She did not move. The tomato juice ran between her fingers and dripped onto the floor, and she stood there for a long time, very still, while something inside her understood what her mind was not yet ready to confirm. The verdict had already been delivered. She just hadn't been officially informed yet. It happened on a Thursday. Ifeoma knew this because Thursday was the day she bought fresh fish from the market on Afka Road, the tilapia Roland preferred, the ones the old seller called NWA, Mimmiri, Children of the Water, with a laugh that was missing 3 teeth. She had bought the fish. She had walked home with it wrapped in newspaper, the smell of the river still on her hands. She had turned into the compound and seen the smoke. Not a fire, not an accident. A fire has a wild quality. It reaches, it surprises, it apologizes for nothing. What she saw was controlled, deliberate, the kind of burning that requires a decision made in advance, a location chosen, materials gathered, her wrapper, her good blouse, the blue one with the embroidered collar that she wore to church on important Sundays. The 2 dresses Roland had bought her in the first year of their marriage, before things became complicated. The black shoes. The wrapper her own mother had given her on her wedding day, the one with the gold thread woven along the border. All of it in a pile in the corner of the compound, behind the water tank, where the smoke would be visible from the road, but not immediately obvious from the gate. Mama Okafor stood a few feet from the fire, with her arms folded across her chest and her face arranged in the expression Ifeoma had come to recognize as her administrative face, the one she wore when she was supervising something she considered a household necessity. Sunday rice, Christmas decorations. This, 2 of Roland's aunties stood behind her, elder women with grey woven into their hair and grandchildren in their laps on ordinary days. They were watching the fire in silence, not the silence of horror, the silence of presence of women who understood that being present was itself a form of permission, and who had decided, separately or together, that permission was what this moment required of them. Ifeoma stood at the entrance to the compound, with the newspaper-wrapped fish in her hands, and did not scream. She wanted to. The scream was there, she could feel it pressed behind her sternum like a fist. But something older and more practiced than instinct told her that screaming was what they expected, and that what they expected they had already prepared for. They had already composed their faces into the expressions that would be deployed in response to her scream. Patient, sorrowful, resigned, this is not what we wanted. But you understand, some things must be done. She understood something else entirely. She understood that the decision had not been made today. Today was only the execution. The decision had been made weeks ago, quietly, in the sitting room at Mama Okafor's end of the compound, in the language of sighs and implications and carefully chosen silences, that this family spoke more fluently than any other. She understood that Philippa already existed. She did not know her name yet. She would learn it later from the compound girls, who whispered it with a kind of guilty excitement, the way young women whisper about things that thrill and disturb them in equal measure. Philippa Eze, 22 years old, from a family that had 4 children in the first generation and 7 in the second. Fertile blood, one of the aunties had supposedly said. As if a woman were a field to be assessed before planting. Roland was not in the compound. Roland was at work, or somewhere that was not here, which was itself an answer to a question Ifeoma had not allowed herself to ask directly until now. She set the fish down on the low concrete wall by the gate. She looked at the fire for a long time. The blue blouse was the last thing to fully catch the embroidery, resisted for a moment, the gold thread of her mother's wrapper curling before it gave in. Then it was all the same. Ash and smoke and a smell that sat at the back of the throat for days. She walked out of the compound. She did not know where she was going. Her feet chose the road before her mind did, and she walked for a long time in the afternoon heat without registering the distance. Somewhere along the way she realized she was still carrying nothing. No bag, no phone, no fish. She had left everything at the gate. Mama Nika arrived 2 days later on the first available bus from Enugu. She walked through the door of the small room where Ifeoma had been staying at cousin's place, a narrow mattress and a window that faced a wall, and she sat down beside her daughter on the mattress and pulled her close without saying a word, not one word. Just her arms and her warmth and the sound of her breathing. They sat that way for a very long time. Outside, the afternoon went about its business. A hawker called out prices. A generator coughed to life. The world continued, as it always does, entirely without apology. Her mother's house had 2 rooms and a kitchen that was really just a corner of the back veranda with a gas burner and a shelf. The walls were painted the pale yellow that Ifeoma remembered from childhood, a colour that had seemed cheerful then and now seemed simply honest, the way old things are honest, without apology or pretence. She was 31 years old. She said it to herself sometimes, quietly. in the early mornings before her mother woke, not as an accusation, not with the bitterness that the women in Roland's compound had wanted to plant in her, but simply as a fact she was still learning to hold. 31. No marriage, no children, no position in this town where everyone remembered her as Mama Necker's second daughter, the one who used to recite poetry at the school's end-of-year assembly. People greeted her warmly and then let their eyes do the calculation, the quick, involuntary arithmetic that people perform when they see a woman returned home in circumstances they have already heard a version of. She was patient with their eyes. She did not owe them a different face. She slept on the narrow bed she had slept on at 15, beneath the same window, listening to the same sounds, the neighbour's cockerel, the distant generator, the way her mother's breathing changed when she passed from light sleep into something deeper. There was a particular comfort in old sounds, she discovered. Not happiness, but a kind of tethering, proof that she was still somewhere real. The nursing program was not a dream she had carried. She had not grown up wanting to be a nurse in the quiet, certain way some children carry their futures like lanterns. It came to her the way practical things come to practical people as a solution. She needed to do something with her hands that was not sitting still. She needed to go somewhere 3 days a week that was not her mother's 2 rooms. She needed a reason to get dressed in the morning that was external to herself, because she had discovered that internal reasons in those early months were not always reliable. She mentioned it once, carefully, over dinner. Her mother looked at her for a long moment across the small table, the kerosene lamp between them casting its warm, uncertain light. Then she said, "Tell me what you need for the form." That was all. No performance of enthusiasm, no speeches, just the practical question, offered in the tone of a woman who understood that the most loving thing you can do for a person who is barely standing is to simply help them take the next step without making them explain why they need to. Bridget drove her to the entrance exam in a borrowed Camry that smelled of air freshener and old receipt. Bridget was the kind of woman who spoke in complete sentences and strong opinions, and had once told a man at a bus stop to close his mouth when he tried to comment on her clothing. She had been Ifeoma's friend since secondary school. She had driven 4 hours the day she heard about the burning, arrived at the cousin's place, sat down and said, "Right, what do we do?" Not a question. A declaration of direction. She waited outside in the car during the exam, reading a novel she had already read twice, because she said unfamiliar books required concentration, and concentration was for people who were not busy praying under their breath. Ifeoma came out of the examination hall an hour and 40 minutes later and stood in the afternoon glare with the results paper in her hand. She had passed. Not barely, clearly, with a score that placed her in the first intake. She stood there and looked at the paper and felt something move through her that she could not name precisely. Not joy, exactly. Something quieter than joy. Something more structural, like a beam settling into place in a building that had been uncertain for a long time. She walked to the car. She opened the door and sat down. Bridget put down the novel and looked at her. Ifeoma held out the paper. Bridget read it again, and then slowly, helplessly, entirely unlike herself, her face crumpled, And that was what broke it open. Not the result, not the 9 years of waiting rooms and injections and herbs and calendars, not the burning clothes, or the woman named Philippa, or Roland's voice saying a man can only wait so long. Not any of it. Just Bridget crying in a borrowed car in a car park 3 towns from home, completely unable to stop. Ifeoma pressed her hands over her face, and for the first time since the Thursday the fire burned, she wept. Philippa arrived on a Saturday. This was not incidental. Saturdays in the Okafor compound were the days when the most people were home, when aunties visited and neighbours dropped in, and children ran between the legs of adults who were too busy talking to notice them. A Saturday arrival was a public arrival. It was a statement dressed as a homecoming. She was 22 years old, and she carried herself the way young women carry themselves when they have been told their whole lives that they are exactly what is needed. Not arrogant, exactly. Something more settled than arrogance, a deep, inherited certainty, the kind that doesn't require performance because it has never once been challenged. She wore a yellow dress and her hair was freshly done, and she smiled at everyone in the compound with the open warmth of a woman who has no reason yet to guard herself. Beatrice, who had been Mama Okafor to Ifeoma for 9 years and was now simply Mama had slaughtered a goat. This was the detail that the compound would remember, not the yellow dress, not the music that played from the Bluetooth speaker on the veranda, not the small canopy that had been erected in the courtyard and draped with matching fabric in a colour scheme that had clearly required advance planning. The goat, because there had been no goat for Ifeoma. There had been no canopy, no speaker, no matching fabric. There had been a church ceremony and a quiet gathering and a meal cooked by the women of the compound in the ordinary way of things, without ceremony, without spectacle. Ifeoma had arrived the way a practical decision arrives, acknowledged, incorporated, moved on from. Philippa arrived the way a vindication arrives. The compound filled and ate and drank, and the women danced in the way that women dance at celebrations that carry more meaning than their surface. They were not merely celebrating a wedding. They were celebrating a proof, the confirmation of something they had believed and now held in their hands like evidence. Roland's uncle made a speech. He said things about new seasons and God's timing and the blessing of a home filled with children, and he said these things with his eyes moving briefly, involuntarily, in the direction of the road, as if Ifeoma might be standing somewhere at the edge of all this, watching. She was not. She was in her mother's 2-room house in Enugu, 3 weeks into her 2nd semester, with a textbook open on the narrow bed and the sound of the neighbour's cockerel coming through the window. She did not know about the goat. Within 11 months, Philippa was pregnant. Beatrice received the news with a stillness that was, somehow, louder than shouting. She sat down slowly in her chair in the sitting room, the chair she occupied, the way a magistrate occupies a bench, and she pressed both hands flat against her thighs, and she breathed through her nose for a long moment. Then she said, "I knew, just that, I knew." As if the pregnancy were not a biological event, but the outcome of her own particular wisdom, a thing she had understood and arranged, and was now watching arrive on schedule. The baby came. A boy. Then, 18 months later, a girl. Then, barely 2 years after that, another boy. 3 children in 4 years, arriving with the regularity of something decided in advance, and each one received by Beatrice with a specific quality of satisfaction that the women of the compound struggled to name precisely, but could feel clearly a satisfaction that had edges to it, that pressed against something that was not entirely about the children themselves, but about what the children proved. She held each baby with her chin slightly raised. "This," she said, "at the naming ceremony for the first, while the guests ate and the music played, is what a real wife brings into a home." Nobody responded directly. The words landed in the room and stayed there, the way certain words do not because they were true, but because no one present had the particular kind of courage required to contradict them in that moment, surrounded by evidence, surrounded by celebration, surrounded by the accumulated weight of a woman who had decided a long time ago that she was not wrong. Roland held his children and loved them in the uncomplicated way that fathers love children who were right in front of them. The first boy looked like his mother. The girl had his own eyes. He was happy, or something close enough to happiness that he had stopped examining the difference. He did not think about Ifeoma, or when the thought came arriving sometimes in the small, unguarded moments, early morning or late night, he moved past it the way you move past a door you have decided not to open. He had made his choice. He needed it to have been the right one. She met Desmond Adichie on a Saturday in October at the wedding of a colleague from the hospital where she had been working for 2 years. She almost did not go. She had been on her feet since 6 that morning, a difficult delivery on the ward, a mother who had screamed and then gone very quiet and then screamed again, and by the time her shift ended, the idea of changing into something presentable and sitting in a hall full of happy people felt like a task she had not budgeted energy for. But Nurse Amaka had said, "You never come anywhere with the particular tone of someone delivering both an observation and a verdict," and Ifeoma had looked at herself in the hospital bathroom mirror for a long moment and decided that Amaka was not wrong. He was sitting at the table to her left during the reception, not dancing, which was the first thing she noticed. Not because he was reluctant or removed, he was present, watching the floor with what appeared to be genuine amusement, but because he seemed to find the thing that was actually funny rather than the thing everyone else was laughing at. When the MC made the predictable jokes, Desmond smiled politely. When the groom's young nephew marched onto the dance floor entirely uninvited and began to demonstrate a routine of his own invention, Desmond laughed a real laugh, surprised out of him, that reached his eyes and stayed there. Ifeoma found herself watching him the way she used to watch her primary 4 students when they didn't know she was looking, with the particular attention you give to something you are trying to correctly understand. They spoke first about the food the jollof was exceptional, they agreed, with the seriousness that jollof deserves, and then about the work she did, and then about the work he did, bridges and drainage systems, and the particular stubbornness of waterlogged soil in certain parts of the delta. He made tea without being asked when they moved to a quieter corner of the hall, appearing with 2 cups the way people do when they are accustomed to noticing what others need before those others have named it. She noticed this. She filed it. They spoke for 2 hours. She told him on the 4th meeting. A Tuesday evening at a small restaurant near the hospital, the kind of place with plastic menu covers and a television mounted too high on the wall, showing a football match no one was watching. She told him, because she had learned slowly, expensively, that the cost of honesty paid up front is always lower than the cost of revelation paid later. She had learned this the way you learn most important things, by surviving the alternative. She kept her voice even. She told him, 9 years, no child, the aunties with their pitying food, the fire in the compound, the woman named Philippa, the Thursday she had walked out with nothing in her hands. He was quiet for a moment when she finished. Not the quiet of discomfort she had learned to read that particular silence, the way the shoulders tightened slightly, the way the eyes made small adjustments. This was different. This was the quiet of a person who was thinking rather than composing. Then he said, "Did they test you both, or just you?" She stared at him. The question landed somewhere very specific, not in her mind, but lower somewhere in the chest, behind the sternum, in the place where the 9 years lived in their compressed and careful arrangement. "Just me," she said. He nodded slowly. He looked at his tea. He looked back at her. And then he said, with a simplicity that made the thing enormous rather than small, "That wasn't a diagnosis. That was a guess with your name on it." Something shifted in the air between them. She would not be able to describe it precisely afterwards, when Bridget pressed her for details in the way Bridget always pressed for details. It was not romantic, exactly not the kind of shift you read about in the books that arrive in brown paper packaging. It was more structural than that. The feeling of a load that has been carried at an angle for a very long time, being gently, carefully set down flat. They married the following year. A small ceremony, the same compound where her mother had cried into her hands at the borrowed Camry story, the same kerosene lamp honesty, different light. Desmond cried. He did not try to hide it. She was pregnant within 6 months. Tobias arrived on a Tuesday morning, which felt appropriate somehow. Tuesdays had always been her most reliable day. He was small and certain and furiously loud from the first breath, as if he had opinions about the room and intended to make them known immediately. The midwife placed him in Epheoma's arms. She had expected to say something. She had been composing things, quietly, for months. Sentences, fragments, some speech the moment felt like it deserved. But when his weight settled against her chest and she felt him breathe, all of it left her, every word, every prepared thing. She simply held him and breathed. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole answer to a question she had been asking in one form or another since she was 25 years old and keeping a calendar, and still believed that if she wanted something badly enough and was patient enough and good enough, the world would eventually meet her there. The world had not met her there, but Tuesday had. 18 years is long enough to forget the shape of a wound. Not the wound itself. Wounds leave marks. Everyone knows this, but the precise shape of it, the exact edges, the particular way it used to press against the inside of your chest on quiet evenings. Epheoma had not forgotten. But she had grown around it the way a tree grows around a nail, incorporating the old damage into something larger and sturdier until the nail was simply part of the structure, unremarkable, no longer worth pointing out. Tobias was 17 now. He was angular in the way of boys who have recently grown faster than they expected, slightly surprised by the length of his own arms, moving through doorways with new care. He had Epheoma's eyes, which was the thing people said first, always when they met him. Her exact eyes, the quality of attention in them, the way they rested on a thing long enough to actually see it before moving on. He had Desmond's calm, the particular unhurried steadiness of a man who has decided not to be rushed by anyone. The combination produced a boy who was, at 17, already more anchored than most adults Epheoma knew. He was studying for his WAEC examinations at the kitchen table when she left for her Saturday shift. He did not look up when she passed. He raised one hand in the gesture that meant, "Goodbye, I know you're leaving, I love you, don't ask me anything right now." She touched the top of his head briefly. He tolerated this, barely, and went out into the morning. She did not think about Roland Okafor often. There were weeks at a time when his name did not surface in her mind at all, and she had come to regard this as neither achievement nor failure, but simply as evidence that the years had done their ordinary work. He was a man she had once been married to. He lived across town. She knew, in the vague way you know things about people in a city where everyone shares 6 degrees of connection, that Philippa had given him 3 children. She knew Mama Okafor had died 2 years ago, a fact she had heard at the market and received with the neutral, minor solemnity you feel at the passing of someone who once did you harm and has now moved beyond the reach of your accounting. She did not know about Victor. She would learn it the way she always learned things about that household, sideways, second-hand, carried to her by someone who was not sure whether to bring it at all. Nurse Amaka, of all people, sitting in the small staff room at the end of a long Friday, peeling an orange with the focused deliberateness she brought to all tasks, said, "You heard about the Okafor boy, the eldest one?" Epheoma had not heard. Victor was 14 years old, Philippa's firstborn, and he had been unwell since the harmattan began. Not the ordinary unwell of childhood, not the fevers and coughs that came and went like visitors. This was something that stayed. Something in the blood. The doctors at the specialist hospital in Auka had used words that Epheoma, as a nurse, recognized immediately, and that a non-medical person would need to have explained twice before the weight of them landed. They had requested the full family medical history. They had ordered blood typing for the household, Roland first, then Philippa, then the children, one by one. It was a routine part of the assessment, the doctor had explained. Necessary for understanding inheritance patterns, for building the complete clinical picture. Roland had gone in on a Monday morning. He had given his blood with the unconcerned practicality of a man who has never had reason to distrust his own body's answers. The results would take 10 days. In those 10 days, and this was the part that would travel, quietly, through the small channels of common knowledge until it reached Epheoma's ears, something changed in Mama Okafor's eldest surviving sister, Beatrice, a woman of 71, who had been present at every significant event in that family for 5 decades, who had sat in the compound the Thursday the clothes burned, who had folded her arms and watched the smoke rise with the expression of a woman performing a necessary duty, a woman who was not, in anyone's recollection, uncertain about anything. She had gone to the hospital with Roland on the Monday. She had sat in the waiting room while he gave his blood. She had driven back to the compound in silence. And then, for 10 days, she did not visit, she did not call, she did not send food. The compound girls noticed. Philippa noticed. Roland, distracted by his son's illness, did not. But Beatrice sat in her own house across town and did not move in the direction of the Okafor compound. And something in her face had acquired a quality no one could quite name. Not guilt, not fear, something earlier than both of those things. Something that looked, to the few people who saw her in those 10 days, like a woman who has done a calculation she cannot undo and is waiting, very quietly, for the answer to arrive. Dr. Stephen was a man who had spent 22 years delivering news that changed lives, and the discipline of those years showed in the way he held a room. He did not shift in his chair. He did not soften his voice into the particular register that people used when they were about to say something terrible and wanted the softness to function as a cushion. He spoke clearly, at a normal pace, in the tone of someone who understood that the kindest thing you could offer a person in a moment like this was not gentleness but precision. Vagueness, in his experience, was what people actually struggled to recover from. The mind could process a clear fact. It was the fog of implication that drove people to the edge. He placed the folder on the desk between them and opened it. Roland sat across from him with his hands resting on his thighs, and Beatrice sat 2 chairs to his left. She had insisted on coming, in the way she insisted on all things, with a certainty that did not invite discussion. She was wearing her good ankara, the deep green one, which she had put on that morning with the unconscious authority of a woman who had always dressed for significance. She sat with her back straight and her chin at the angle that meant she was paying full attention and expected to be the first to understand whatever was said. Dr. Stephen looked at Roland. He said, "The test results confirm a chromosomal condition that has been present since birth. The specific variant affects reproductive function. It is not something that developed over time, and it is not something that can be reversed. Clinically, what this means," he paused, not for drama, but to ensure the next words landed without ambiguity, "is that biological fatherhood is not possible for you. It has never been possible. Not 9 years ago, not now." Roland did not move. The air conditioning unit in the corner hummed. A phone rang briefly somewhere outside the closed door, then stopped. Roland was looking at the folder on the desk, without looking at it the gaze of a man whose eyes had stayed in one place while his mind had gone somewhere else entirely. "Repeat that," he said. Dr. Stephen repeated it. The same words, the same pace, the same tone. He did not add anything. He did not subtract anything. Roland sat with it. You could see him sitting with it, the precise, visible process of a man inserting a new piece of information into a structure he had built over decades, and watching in real time as the structure recalculated. Not collapsed, recalculated. Because the mind is stubborn. And the first thing it does with the unbearable is not accept it, but measure it, turn it, look for the angle where it might mean something other than what it plainly means. Then Dr. Stephen turned a page in the folder. He said, in the same even voice, without any change in register that might suggest this information was of a different order. The DNA profiling completed as part of Victor's case assessment also included comparative analysis for all 3 children. He did not look up from the page. None of the 3 share your genetic profile. The results are consistent across all children. The room went very still. Not silent, the air conditioning still hummed. The world outside continued. But the particular stillness of a space in which something irreversible has just been said out loud for the first time and can no longer be unsaid. Roland's hands, still resting on his thighs, did not move. His face did not change in any dramatic way, but something left it some quality that had been present a moment ago and was simply no longer there, the way light leaves a room when a cloud passes, quietly and completely, and without any sound at all. Beatrice did not speak. Beatrice, who had an opinion on everything that had ever happened in that family. Beatrice, who had supervised the burning of clothes in a compound corner with her arms folded and her face arranged into administrative certainty. Beatrice, who had sat in the elder women's circle and nodded along and said she stays in this family as if a woman's life were a property dispute. Beatrice, who had spent 9 years understanding in her body what she had never permitted herself to confirm in her mind, because confirmation would have required a different set of actions, and she had not been ready for those actions, and so she had done what powerful people do when they cannot afford the truth. She had chosen the version of events that cost her the least, the version that cost Ifeoma everything. She sat in the good green Ankara in the humming quiet of Dr. Stephen's office and stared at a point on the wall just above the folder. And for the first time in 71 years, Beatrice Okafor had absolutely nothing to say. Dr. Stephen was not a man who softened medical information beyond what was useful. He had been a urologist and reproductive specialist for 19 years, and he had learned early that the kindest thing you could do for a patient was to be precise, to give them something real, to hold, rather than a version of reality shaped to protect feelings that would need to be reshaped again later. He sat across from Roland in his consultation room with the lab report on the desk between them, and he said what the numbers said, plainly, without theatre. Roland's sperm motility was severely compromised. Not borderline, not the kind of thing that could be attributed to stress or diet or a single difficult season. The condition was structural, long-standing, and this was the word that would echo in Roland's chest for the rest of that week primary, meaning it had always been there, meaning it had been there at 28, at 30, at 35, when the aunties were bringing their casseroles and lowering their eyes at Ifeoma's stomach. It had been there the morning the clothes burned. Roland sat very still. The doctor continued. He explained, in the measured language of a man who understands that facts have consequences, that this type of condition could be identified through a basic semen analysis. A standard procedure, a test conducted at any diagnostic laboratory with minimal equipment. He paused here not for dramatic effect, but to allow the information to settle before adding what came next. The test cost, at today's rates, less than 3,000 naira. It had cost considerably less 18 years ago, less, certainly, than the treatments Ifeoma had undergone, less than the injections, the specialist appointments, the herbs from the old woman in Nui who charged by the consultation. Roland heard this. He understood it. And then his mind did the thing that minds do when they receive information that restructures everything. It went very quiet, and then very loud, and then quiet again, in rapid, disorienting cycles. He had watched his wife sit in waiting rooms for 9 years. He had watched her take injections that left bruises like small dark suns on her arms. He had watched her fast and pray and go to the old woman in Nui and return with the smell of bark and earth on her clothes and try again. He had watched all of this, and he had allowed the compound's conclusion, the slow, accumulated verdict delivered through sighs and pitying glances, and his mother's administrative face to become his own. Not because he was certain, but because certainty had been offered to him in one direction, and he had accepted it without looking in the other. No one had asked him to give blood. Not once. Not in 9 years. Not his mother, who had organized the burning. Not Beatrice, who had prescribed the herbs. Not the aunties who arrived with casseroles and left with their sympathies intact. Not a single elder in that compound had turned to Roland Okafor and said, "But have you been tested?" The question had not been considered worth asking. He was the man. The man was not the problem. The woman was always the problem. This was not a rule anyone had written down, but it was a rule everyone had followed with complete unconscious efficiency for as long as anyone in that compound could remember. Doctor. Stephen had seen this before. He said so gently to the space between them. He said that in his 19 years of practice, roughly 40% of infertility cases involved a male factor, either as the sole cause or as a contributing one. He said that in a significant number of the cases that crossed his desk, the woman had already been through years of treatment, social consequence, and in some instances, family dissolution, before anyone thought to test the husband. He said this not with judgment, but with the steady gravity of a man who has watched a preventable thing happen too many times to pretend it is rare. Roland left the consultation room and sat in his car for 45 minutes without starting the engine. He thought about Iphioma, not the Iphioma he had allowed himself to remember in the intervening years, softened by time, abstracted into the category of first marriage, difficult chapter, the real one, the one who had sliced tomatoes in the kitchen and come home with fish wrapped in newspaper on the last Thursday of their marriage, the one who had sat across from him in waiting rooms with her hands folded in her lap, composed and patient, prepared to absorb whatever the doctor said because she had already accepted that the answer, whatever it was, lived inside her body. She had never known. She had walked out of that compound 18 years ago, carrying a verdict that was never hers. She had built a life around surviving a sentence she had not earned on a charge that had never been proven, because no one in that compound, not one single person, had thought to ask the correct question. The car park was almost empty now. He sat in the silence and understood, with the full and terrible clarity of a man finally looking at something he should have looked at a long time ago, that the harm was not reversible. You cannot return 18 years. You cannot unburn a wrapper with gold thread woven along the border. You cannot reach back into a woman's history and remove the weight she carried through corridors and examination rooms and her mother's 2-room house, believing herself to be the reason, when the reason had been sitting across the dinner table all along. Some truths arrive too late to save anyone. They arrive only in time to teach. Bridget told her on a Thursday evening, which felt like the kind of coincidence that isn't really coincidence, just the universe returning to the same day, because it knows which days carry weight in a particular life. She called without preamble, the way Bridget always called. No greeting, no softening, just. The test came back. It was him, Iphioma. It was always him. Iphioma said nothing for a moment. She was standing in the corridor outside the ward, her shift badge still clipped to her chest, the sounds of the hospital moving around her wheels on linoleum, a distant monitor, someone asking for water in a tired voice. She said, "I know." And the strange thing was that she did know, had known, in the way you know something you have never allowed yourself to fully articulate, because articulating it would have required you to also articulate everything that was done to you in its name. She sat with it for 3 days, not in paralysis, not in the old, familiar grief that used to live behind her sternum like a stone. She went to work. She made Tobias's favourite egusi soup on the second evening. She sat on the back veranda with Desmond on the third night and listened to him describe a problem with a drainage project in language she barely followed, and she held his hand and watched the dark and felt, with a steadiness that surprised her, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. On the fourth morning, she told Desmond where she was going. He looked at her for a long moment. He did not try to talk her out of it. He did not offer to come. He simply said, "Come home after." And she understood that he meant it in the fullest sense of the word, not the house, but everything the house contained. She drove herself. The restaurant she chose was neutral ground, not the part of town where she had once been a wife, not the part where she was now a nurse and a mother and Desmond's person. Somewhere in between. Plastic menu covers. A television mounted too high on the wall. A place with no history that belonged to either of them. Roland arrived 3 minutes after her. He had aged in the way men age, when they have been carrying something they did not know they were carrying. The weight had settled in his face, around his eyes, in the particular set of his jaw. He sat down across from her and he looked at the table. She did not begin with the obvious thing. She was not there to perform his reckoning for him. He had already had his reckoning, alone in a car park, and whatever that had cost him was between him and the 19 years he had misplaced. She was there for something smaller and more personal. She wanted to look at him and feel, finally, that what had happened to her was not the result of something deficient in her nature, not a punishment, not a verdict, not the universe's assessment of her worth. She wanted to see, in the ordinary and diminished face of this man, across a plastic-covered table, that it had simply been fear. His family's fear of a thing they did not understand, and his own failure quiet, daily, accumulated to stand between her and that fear, when he was the only person positioned to do so. She saw it. It was there in the way he could not meet her eyes, in the way his hands rested on the table with the stillness of a man who has run out of comfortable positions. It was not monstrous. That was the thing she had needed to confirm. It was not monstrous, it was ordinary, which was, in its own way, worse, but also, in its own way, easier to leave behind. "I should have," he said near the end. She raised one hand. She shook her head. "Yes," she said, "you should have." She left before he could arrange his face into whatever came next. Tobias was parked outside with the engine off, one arm resting on the open window, watching the road. He had his father's calm and her eyes, and 18 years of watching a woman refuse to be reduced. He turned when she opened the door. "How did it go?" "It went," she said. He nodded. He started the car. They drove home through the ordinary afternoon, the hawkers, the generators, the city going about its business without apology, and she watched the road and felt nothing she needed to name. The next morning she was at the kitchen window before 6, both hands around a cup of tea that was just past too hot. The garden was already bright, that particular early morning gold that doesn't last. Tobias was in the chair beneath the mango tree, with a textbook open across his knees, his head bent, entirely absorbed. He had not heard her. He was simply there, solid and certain, and breathing in the garden of the life she had built from the wreckage of a lie told about her body by people who never asked her body for the truth. She watched him for a long time. She was not thinking about Roland. She was not thinking about Beatrice, or the aunties, or the gold thread of her mother's wrapper curling in a fire that had been lit with such confident wrongness. She was not thinking about the 9 years, or the waiting rooms, or the weight of a verdict that was never hers. She was thinking about how the morning light moved across the garden. She was thinking that the tea was exactly the right temperature now. She was thinking that Tobias had grown into the particular angle of his left shoulder, that he no longer seemed surprised by it. She was thinking that the life they had tried to erase had turned out to be the most real one she ever had. And that was enough. That was, after everything, more than enough. And that is the story of Ifeoma Nwosu, a woman they called Barren, a woman they burned out of a compound with nothing in her hands and a verdict that was never hers. A woman who did not collapse, not because she was superhuman, but because she was human in the most complete sense of the word. She grieved, she rebuilt, she loved again. And 18 years later, the truth walked into a consultation room and sat down across from the man who had never thought to ask the right question. The fire did not erase her. It lit her way out. If this story moved you, if you have known a woman like Ifeoma, or if some part of you is Ifeoma, share this video. Because somewhere right now, a woman is sitting in a waiting room carrying a diagnosis that belongs to someone else. And she needs to know that the verdict they gave her is not the final word. Subscribe if you are new here. We tell stories like this one, stories of real pain, real endurance, and the kind of truth that takes 18 years to arrive, but arrives nonetheless. Drop a comment below. Tell us what this story meant to you. And remember, the life they try to erase is sometimes the most real one you will ever live. We will see you in the next one.